In this video, I'm finally setting up my dream palette. It's shaped like a color wheel. It's the Quiller palette. This palette is designed to make color theory and color mixing a lot easier because it's already in a color wheel format. If you haven't seen my previous videos where I go through how to create a split primary palette, I would highly recommend you watch that first so that this video makes more sense. I'm essentially planning out my color wheel as an expanded version of the split primary palette, and so this makes color mixing a lot easier. I'll be going through all my paints and putting them together in this one massive collection and going through all my warm and cool colors. On this palette, you'll see an indication for the three primaries, so they have these little arrow points. Even the secondary are noted with a little narrow arrow. I will go through each of these steps and my process, and I hope that it's helpful to you if you're looking to do something similar. Alright, so before we start, we need to prep our palette, and this is just a little example of this plastic palette. It's a travel size, and I did not prep the surface area, so you can see that the paint is beating up quite a bit. And it's a little bit hard to really see that color, especially if you're doing a couple mixes of different colors. And this is an old palette, so it's actually been worn down a bit, so it's not too bad. But a brand new plastic palette would beat up quite a bit more like the way that orange is looking. So whether you have a plastic palette or a metal tin type palette, the surface will need to be prepped. Now this is a ceramic porcelain mixing palette, and you can see when I mix the colors here how nice and even this washes and it does not beat up, so you don't need to really prep it when it's a porcelain tray like this. This is why it's such a dream, and for any painter to use something like this is a lot nicer. You don't have to go invest in it right away. You can use whatever you have on hand, but I'm just showing you the difference in case you're interested in exploring your options. So I have a brand new Stephen Quiller circular palette here. Now I haven't prepped this, so I will. It's got so many different wells and spaces for paint. You'll see the corner is a bit nicked. This is a plastic palette. There is an option to get a porcelain version of this, and it's a very large size. However, it's quite a bit pricier, so I thought I would test out this color wheel system before I invest in that. And because it's such a large size, I plan on keeping it in the studio on my desk, and it won't be moving around too much. And I have a bunch of tube paints to go through and sort, and I can't wait to fill this up. So before getting started, I'm going to refer to my split primary palette. I did this in a previous video, and I'm also going to be using my swatch cards so I can reference each of the colors and the paint properties. The split primary palette is ideal for me. It's got a warm and cool for each of the primaries, and it makes the brightest colors for all the secondary and tertiary colors, so I plan on following that. I like this system because it's really easy to see your different color palette options. You can do analogous or complementary or split complementary really easily when you understand the color wheel and some basics of color theory. I have a whole playlist on color mixing, so I'll link that and you can check out those videos if you haven't already seen them. Okay, hello, this is Future Nisha interjecting. I wanted to quickly just say that if you happen to have just a standard palette, this is a plastic one, and I also have one of these metal ones, you can still do a color wheel system. You would just organize your colors in a way that made sense to you. So maybe putting your warm and cool colors in pairs. You could also pair them up and do all your yellows, reds, and blues in pairs across from each other. If you're using a plastic palette, stick your warm and cool primaries on one side if you have a small set like this. Or you could also use that entire row and go in spectral order. So it's not as important to have an actual color wheel palette. So I wanted to just make that clear so you don't feel like you have to run out and purchase anything that you don't absolutely need currently. Use what you have, stay in your budget. Art supplies always add up, and so I wanted to just quickly say that. The color wheel palette is more of a convenience. It's something I've waited a little bit of time to build up, and purchase and start using. So whether you actually use a specific wheel palette or not, just know that you have a lot of choices. Really what will come in handy is having a color wheel, whether it's a purchased one or one that you created from your specific paints. This will give you all the information that you really need. Okay, let's go back to the main video now. Okay, so for the first step, I'm going to categorize all my paint swatches into general groupings. So all the yellows, all the reds, all the greens, etc. together. I've also got a set of my St. Petersburg palette here, which I plan to also combine into this palette because I really like some of these neutral, natural colors here. Like they have raw sienna and the umbers and the sepias, which is really nice also. And this is a good quality paint. It's a nice starter paint set, and I've had it for years, and I'm still using it, so it does last quite a long time. But now that I'm switching over into tube paints, I'm going to make this transition by finishing these off as well, so that way I'm not wasting them, and then when those are finished, I can replace those colors with tube paints. Alright, so I'm starting with the yellows, and I need a warm yellow and a cool yellow for the primary place on this wheel. And I have quite a few options because I have so many different paint brands. So especially for the primary colors, I'm looking for the cleanest, brightest versions. You can always dirty up a color, but you really can't go the other way. So I want to start with a fresh, pure, bright color for each of the red, yellow, and blue primaries. And you can see that yellow has the most use, especially from the St. Petersburg palette here. And that's because it's such a light color. You need so much more of it when you're mixing your secondary and tertiary colors. And so I go through the yellows really quickly. So I'm actually looking to put quite a lot of yellows here. So it will last me a while. And you need a lot less of the other colors. So I'll put a fewer amount of those colors. Alright, so this is a brand new palette, so I'm going to prep the surface. And I have this magic eraser, which is great for just scuffing up that surface really. It's really subtle. It's not going to give you deep scratches. You can also use a sand eraser, which I find works really well too. And that will take care of that surface as well. And this will give me a nice mixing space and surface for when I go to make my color mixes. Okay, so with my palette surface prepped and everything ready to go, I can start filling in my little paint wells here. And I'm just going to use my color wheel to try to match the colors as best as possible. And I'm not planning on making this too much of a commitment. I may switch these out as I go. I may have to rethink things or buy extra paints and tubes and brands I might want to try. So I see this as an ongoing process. So what I'll do is put in my best guess for now, and then as I use it, I feel like I'll have a better idea of how to customize it even further. If you're interested in the exact paint names and brands that I'm using, I will put a list down below in the description, and you can see if you have something similar, and if you're interested in following along, you can use that list as a reference. Alright, so my yellows are in now, and so now I'm going to use a range of warm oranges going to warm red, and so now I can choose those. I also made a quick little mock-up of my palette here so that I can label everything. Once I'm committed, I'll probably label the actual paint tray, but because I'm still not 100% sure if I'm going to keep all these colors exactly where they are, I'm going to use a separate sheet to catalog them. This is such an important step, especially if you have different paint brands and sometimes even the same name of paint, but different brands can have a very different color. So writing down the exact name and pigment is really important so you can always reference the correct color, especially if you run out and you want to repurchase that exact paint. Okay, so now I'm going through all my warmer colors, the pinks, the reds, and some of these pinks and reds are cool, so those will go towards the bottom of that wheel, and the warmer ones will go towards the yellow. If you notice, there are 4 corners with extra paint wells, and I'm planning on putting my more neutral colors there so that the actual circle wheel part will be just the bright colors. And then once I have a color that's a bit dirtier or more of a neutral or more of a specialty color, I can use those corners to put those paints. Alright, so these are really large wells in the corners, so I took a hot glue gun and I made a little wall, a little separation, so that I could double that space. So instead of 2 on each corner, I now have 4 wells on each corner. And they are quite big. So you can see my half pan fits in there, and that is quite a bit of paint. So I think it'll be really good, and that way I can get a lot more colors and options on this actual palette tray. Okay, so as I'm editing this video, I'm realizing that this is where I made my mistake. I put my cool reds on the right and my warm ones on the left, and it should be reversed. So I will fix this later in the video, and I'll show you how I do it. So if this happens to you, you'll be prepared. Sometimes these things happen, and it's not a big deal. So as I said earlier, it's a work in progress, and done is better than perfect, so you could also just leave it, but because I know it would bother me, I did go ahead and change it. All right, so next to my cool reds, which currently show my warm reds, but I will change that. So I have my violets and mauves and all the purple tones going into my blues. And so I put those purpley violet colors in, and then the blues right after it. Some of these paint tubes are super old, and so the binder had separated from the pigment, and I'm using the back of a paintbrush to mix up that cerulean blue. And if that happens to you and it's old paint, you can always just stir that up and it should fix the problem. Watercolors are really amazing and flexible that way. You can generally save most of them. Sometimes you just need to reactivate it with some water and they should just come right back to life. A lot of these old paints I hadn't used in years, and so they are still good, still pigmented and saturated, and a dream to use. Alright, so I have a little spatula here, and this is where I just realized my mistake with my warm and cool reds. So luckily I had half pans here for my St. Petersburg colors. Those are easy to pull out since they're just in a little tray. Now, that means that the other 2 colors I would have to flip, but because I just want to move 1 and not 2 and try to do the least, salvaging here, I'm going to just pick out that one warm red and switch it to the other side of my cool red. And then that should do the trick. So all my warm reds will be on the correct side, and then the cool reds will be on their correct side. I will say it was a little bit of a heartbreaking process because I just kept thinking how much paint I was wasting, but I did manage to get quite a bit of it out, in fact most of it, and then I just had a little bit of a residue that I wiped down, and then I put my half pan back in and all good. So let's move on. So between the warm reds and the yellows that are warm, there will be warm oranges, and I'll also be putting in some of the warmer neutrals in the corner right behind this part. So even though green and this turquoisey blue are colors you can mix, I got full tubes of them, 1 for convenience and 2 just because I tend to use a lot of this type of color in my work. So a yellow green, which is so beautiful when you look at the rich green gold from Daniel Smith. I really love that color. And then the green gold also from Daniel Smith. And then all of these phthalo turquoise and cobalt turquoises are so gorgeous. So I just got full tubes of them because I know I'll probably go through that type of a color palette quite often. So if you have a certain style or color palette that you tend to use quite often, I would say just go ahead and get colors that are similar. It will save you a lot of time. And once you understand color theory and color mixing, it'll make it a lot faster and easier for you to adjust those colors and lean them slightly cooler or warmer or more neutral if you want to. All right, so I use a lot of green, and so I ended up putting more of the specialty and neutralized colors along that corner section, and I kept the brighter, more primary style of colors in that center wheel part. And so for my brain, when I'm doing color mixing and color theory, this makes a lot of sense so that if I want a more neutralized color, I can just go to that corner. Okay, so right now I am organizing my neutrals, and these are sort of within a warm and cool as well. You can see that that top row is a bit warmer and the middle row is a little bit cooler. You can see some blue undertones. And so once you start putting colors next to each other, you can really start to see which way they lean, if they're warm or cool, and that will help you decide where to place them on your palette. Here's another same color, different pigment of Payne's Gray. Payne's Gray is really one of my favorite colors, but you can really see that this is a difference between brands. That Winsor Newton is much cooler with some bluish tones, and the Attract is really more neutral. And so I think I'll probably use both in my palette for different purposes. Okay, so now selecting colors for the purples. So this ranges from like mauve and warm purples to cooler, more eggplanty purples. And so this is a lot of fun. I find it quite therapeutic actually, just picking colors and putting paint into wells. And I will also say that I have built this color palette over time. It's been many years that I've had tube paints and slowly added to them. My very first professional set, I would say, is the St. Petersburg set. So I recommend that for beginners. And then I went ahead and got the starter set from Daniel Smith and fell in love with the color pigments and just the way that the watercolor mixed, and they play so nicely together. And they really are very translucent, which is a quality I love about watercolor. So definitely take your time and go slow, and don't worry about having all your perfect colors all at once. Okay, so almost done. We are going to now work on the warm neutrals and the oranges and more earthy tones here. So I have two raw umbers here, and I'm not sure which one I really like. So I think I'm gonna have to just make a choice and then move forward. And then I can always switch these out a little bit later if I choose to, I suppose. And luckily, most of these half pans have fit really nicely in the little hot glue gun sections. Some of them are a little bit tighter than others, but so far so good. All right, so one of the things I'm really excited about using in this palette is the mineral paints, the Daniel Smith Genuine series. They have actual mineral in that pigment, and so you get a really pretty granulating effect. So I put a couple of those all around the palette, and if you are interested, again, I will just list that below so you can see which particular paints I have selected. I actually have more than this that would not fit on this palette, so I'll have to figure out what to do with those, but for now, I'm just giving this palette a little bit of a mix with just some regular translucent paints and some specialty granulating colors, and we'll just see how it goes. Okay, so that's a wrap. I've got all my bright colors in that center, all my neutrals and specialties around the corners, and everything is labeled on this paper. So once this dries, what I will do is go ahead and make a proper swatch card for this palette. And I'll have to remember to switch my two warm reds and cool reds where I made that little mistake. So I put little arrows to remind me. I would recommend doing this for any new palette that you start. Okay, so I used my light box and I traced this wheel template onto watercolor paper. So this is where I will do my swatches. Now, if you don't have a light box, don't worry, you can always use something like a bright window. And so you can always tape your paper to the window and put your watercolor paper on top and trace it that way. You can also use carbon graphite paper, which is also great for transferring drawings and sketches. And I will also go through and add a waterproof pen on the outline, and that will keep everything nice and crisp and clean. You do want to make sure though when you're doing this that your pen is waterproof and not water resistant, because once you go over it with your paint and water, it could bleed if it's not specifically waterproof. Okay, and then once that's done, I can go ahead and erase any pencil lines and then get started with painting. All right, so I let my paint palette dry overnight and it's still pretty soft. I mean, the top layer is a bit dry of this paint in each of these wells, but you can definitely feel that it's soft. It's a little bit like a gel sort of texture. So it may take a few more days for all this paint to fully dry. So I would recommend before painting to let your paint fully dry, because that way you're using less paint and you're not accidentally wasting too much. Okay, so I'll start here with the yellow primary and then go through and put the saturated part along the top, and I'm also going to do a lighter wash towards the center. That way I can hopefully get a little bit of a range in that color so that when I go to make any reference choices and look at my colors, I can see what it looks like at full pigment and what looks like a little bit diluted. Okay, so I'm also going every other well. That way each of these little sections can fully dry before I paint next to them, because if you touch too wet areas in watercolor, you will get color bleeding happening, and I don't want that to happen here. So once that first section is dry, then I'll go in and put in the alternate colors in those spaces. Okay, so I'm going in and just adding a second layer on a couple of these and just pumping up that saturation so it's a little bit easier to reference. And then I think we're done. It is such a pretty spectrum of colors. I love looking at projects like this because it's just so pretty to see all the rainbow colors, and they're also vibrant. And then the last step would be to label all of these. Once this is fully dry, I can go in with my waterproof pen and label all of them. But as you can see, it's pretty close to my split primary palette. I've just gone through and added a few more stages of color in between each of these sections. So if you have a limited palette, you can still do something very similar with your split primary palette. You really only need one warm, one cool of each of the primaries, and that actually is only 6. And if you like, for convenience, you can add on tertiary and secondary colors in tubes. That would make your 12 color palette. So don't worry if you don't have this many colors, or if you do have more than this many colors, then you may want to make a second palette. Some of the reds aren't quite accurate. I still have to go through and maybe in the future I'll switch them in their positions because the warm and cool flip-flopping really threw me off. But because I just don't want to go through and redo everything, I'm going to leave it for now. And once I finish a color, I can probably think about switching the colors, and then if I do that, I will just go ahead and make another reference chart and swatch this again in the future. So no big deal. I still know exactly where my reds are and generally where the warm and cool colors are, and so I think it'll still be fine. So there we go. There's my full palette, all labeled, all ready to go. I'm so excited about this. I've been dreaming of making my ideal palette for so long, and now I finally had enough paints and the perfect color wheel palette setup. So I'm going to be testing this out in the future videos, and hopefully this is something that will stick around. If you find color mixing and color theory interesting, I would recommend checking out my color mixing playlist. It comes with a whole PDF download of all templates and charts and guides that you can use, and would hopefully make the color theory process a bit easier. So if you find that helpful, let me know. Also, let me know in the comments what other type of content you would like, because I want to make these videos as valuable as possible. And thank you for watching. I hope this was helpful. I hope it was fun, and I hope it inspired you to create a custom palette for yourself. And I'll see you in the next video.